If you let Hollywood tell the story, they would have you think that only black people experienced slavery. Traditionally, you would only see white Europeans as the ones that control the slaves when it comes to the history books. But what if I told you white slaves owned by Africans also existed and has appeared to be hidden from our history? The slave trade that many of us know is the transatlantic slave trade, which would involve over 12 million African slaves being shipped from Africa to North America. But why don't we hear about the time North Africans would own and trade a reported 1.2 million white European slaves during the Barbary slave trade from 1530 to 1780? This hidden slave trade would mainly take place off the Barbary coast and included the African cities of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers. And just like the transatlantic slave trade that would begin in the mid-1500s, it was a source of income for those involved. The Barbary slave trade consisted of North Africans, a part of the Ottoman Empire, who made white Christians their slaves through piracy. If you don't recall, many Africans were Muslim, and this appears to have played a huge reason as to why traveling white Christians were targeted. But before we had lost sight of land, we were captured by Algerian pirates, who put all the men in irons. This is a direct quote from Reverend de Rose Spratt in April of 1641. Sailing with 120 passengers from Ireland to England. At the time, he was a newly ordained reverend at 21 when he would be captured by Algerian pirates and sentenced to slavery. The miserable destruction of 120 men, women, and children by sword, famine, and many diseases, amongst whom was my mother Elizabeth and my youngest brother Joseph. According to research, in those earlier times, the Mediterranean and the coast of North Africa will become known for piracy. African pirates figured that they could generate profit by hijacking European ships, raiding and robbing them, and enslaving their passengers for profit. In their eyes, they saw the ships as floating banks. Not only did they keep everything of value on the ships, with their captured slaves, they had an extended source of income, as many would hold their new white slaves for ransom, hoping their families would pay for their freedom. Those who were not held for ransom would have a life of servitude and labor. And more specifically for women, they could also become sex slaves, a part of the harems. According to the BBC, there were two categories for Barbary slaves. First, you had the public slaves. These slaves belonged to the ruling Pasha, who by right of rulership could claim an eighth of all Christians captured by corsairs, and by all the others he wanted at reduced prices. These slaves were housed in large prisons known as benos, often in wretchedly overcrowded conditions. They were mostly used to row the corsair galleys in pursuit of loot and more slaves. Work so strenuous that thousands died or went mad while chained to the oar. During the winter, these galeotes worked on state projects, quarrying stone, building walls or harbor facilities, felling timber, and constructing new galleys. Each day they would be given perhaps 2 or 3 loaves of black bread that dogs themselves wouldn't eat, and limited water. They received 1 change of clothing every year. Those who collapsed on the job from exhaustion and malnutrition were typically beaten until they got up and went back to work. The Pasha also bought most female captives, some of whom were taken into his harem, where they lived out their days in captivity. The majority, however, were purchased for the ransom value. While awaiting their release, they worked in the palace as harem attendants. The other groups of slaves belonged to private parties. Their treatment and work varied as much as their masters did. Some were well cared for, becoming virtual companions of their owners. Others were worked as hard as any public slave, in agricultural labor and construction work, or selling water or other goods around the town on his or her owner's behalf. They were expected to pay a portion of their earnings to their owner. Those who failed to raise the required amount, typically being beaten, to encourage them to work harder. The most unlucky ended up stuck and forgotten out in the desert, in some sleepy towns such as Suez, or in the Turkish Sultan's galleys, where some slaves rode for decades without ever setting foot on shore. Unlike African slaves in America, who were taught Christianity but remained slaves, white slaves in Africa who became Muslim were considered free, since enslavement of Muslims was against the law, but this meant they could no longer return home. The operation of white slaves in North Africa would become commonplace and become such a big issue that in 1785, former presidents Thomas Jefferson and John Adams stepped in to put an end to the raids of ships and trade after many European and American ships would become seized. The two men would first travel to London to negotiate with Tripoli's representatives led by Ambassador Sidi Haji Abdrahman, and they asked him what right he had to take slaves in this way. He replied that the right was founded on the laws of the Prophet, that it is written in the Quran that all nations who should not have answered their authority were sinners, that it was the right and duty to make war upon them, wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Mussulman who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Raids and the capturing of white slaves would not only take place on ships, but they would also take place on coastal towns in Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, England, the Netherlands, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and as far as Iceland. According to reports, the coastline between Venice and Malaga were under raid so much that it got to a point there was no one left to capture. As a means of protection, the United States and other European countries at one point would make payments to pirates known as tributes to call off attacks of their ships. At first, Congress approved a maximum of $80,000 to spend on tribute treaties with all the Barbary states. But over time, that amount would quadruple as Barbary states demanded more money. According to crf-usa.org, in 1662, England made the first treaty with a Barbary ruler. This set the pattern for similar treaties by other European nations trading in the Mediterranean. Typically, a Barbary peace treaty required a nation to pay tribute to the pirate ruler, who would then call off attacks on the nation's ships. Tribute usually took the form of a larger payment of money plus annual payments. The annual payments might be cash, military supplies, or expensive presents for the ruler. A particular treaty might also include ransom money for the release of a nation's citizens held captive by the Barbary country. The Barbary rulers frequently demanded that nations renew their treaties for even greater amounts of tribute. Until the nation agreed to new terms, its ships remained fair game for the pirates. And this became the beginning of the decline of the white slave trade. After years of tributes and treaties, the United States would unite with European nations to fight a series of battles against the pirates and their allies. The most popular were known as the First and Second Barbary Wars, in which they would be sparked by refusal to pay the ever-increasing tributes. After the wars, which would be won by Europe and the United States, the region would later be conquered by France. Slave markets in the Mediterranean region would begin to disappear as more European nations occupied the territory. As for the African slave owners, they would not fully stop the trading of European slaves until the 19th and 20th century, when European laws would rule and finally emancipated white slaves. Researcher and author Robert Davis has went on to say, much of what has been written gives the impression that there were not many slaves and minimizes the impact that slavery had on Europe. Most accounts only look at slavery in one place or only for a short period of time. But when you take a broader, longer view, the massive scope of this slavery and its powerful impact become clear. One of the things that both the public and many scholars have tended to take as given is that slavery was always racial in nature, that only blacks have been slaves, but that is not true. You see, by now learning this piece of hidden history, people of African descent can't only look at themselves as victims, when they too ruled freely and for some were masters of Europeans.